Okay, welcome to Varn Vlog Solo, and today we're going to be talking about something unpleasant, which is the left in America, the right in America, and the paradoxes of American crime. Now, I'm going to say this, that what I'm talking about today, I do not mean that all crimes should have moral valence. Property crimes and murder and robbery all have different social effects. Um, I'm not going to be dealing with drug crimes because while I think just decriminalizing them without any social infrastructure to deal with that decriminalization is not just naive but also irresponsible. I don't think that drug crimes by and large should be treated in the same way as either property or violent crime, even though making them illegal contributes more to both. um so we're not going to look at the context of the drug war here, and there's problematic reasons for critiquing me for leaving that out. That's a context for a lot of this, but we're going to be looking at the crime weight per 100,000 from 1960 to 2024. Now, the best chart I found on this, based on aggregate FBI data, actually only goes up to 2019. So I've dug up some new stats to represent the last few years and talk about the tendencies, because I find the talking points in both left and right wing media about these issues to be fundamentally dishonest. And while there are plenty of ways to lie, even with the statistics I'm going to present with you today, and there are some things that this doesn't capture. For example, if we look at the European case, we have to deal with the fact that part of the reasons the murder rate has gone down is that healthcare has improved and there's not high access to firearms, meaning that assaults that used to be lethal are no longer lethal. And that also affects US crime weights. But this is why looking solely at murder, even though murder is the easiest thing to judge because states pretty much all have the definition of what that is, states' definitions on other of these other crimes do not match. And even in how we report them throughout time. So when we deal with things like rape statistics, trigger warning, um, from 2016 and before, rape statistics were only reported for females. All right. So, um, the reason why we started in 1960 is that 1960 starts the Uniform Crime Reporting Program, and so we can look at that. We have to do projections for numbers prior to that, and I don't want to get into that today. Trying to figure out if the 19th century was a lot more murdery than the 20th is a big open question. It probably was, but we don't know that for sure. All right. So, one, we are going to look only at the per 100,000 because if you look at raw numbers, crime is always increasing because the population has been increasing. We're going to look at the overall population rates. This actually gives us a handy thing for that too. And look at the violent crimes per 100,000. So you have a norm control group here. If we start in 1960, we can see the population of the United States is 179 million plus some change. Violent crime altogether, as defined by the Universal Crime Reporting Program, was 160.9 out of 100,000. Murder was actually kind of high compared to Europe at 5.1 per 100,000. This is aggregate for the whole country. Reported rape, and remember, there's a tons of problems with reported forcible rape, but we're looking at pretty much a little under double the murder rate. Robbery is at 60 per 100,000. Aggravated assault is higher than robbery at 80 per 100,000, but burglary, which does not involve actually dealing with a person, was massively larger at 500 per 100,000. Larceny theft was 1,000 something per 100,000, and vehicle theft was about 189 per 100,000. Now, we're just going to jump ahead to 1970. The population has increased to 203 million. Violent crime has more than doubled between 1960 and 1970. Notice, we can have 1,000 theories for that. People blame leaded gasoline. People have blamed deindustrialization, although deindustrialization wasn't really that high yet in 1970. People have blamed trauma from Vietnam. You can do what you look at, but in almost all categories, we see a doubling, with the exception of murder. Murder, we don't see a doubling. Murder, we see an increase to 7.9 per 100,000. But everything else doubled. Burglary, more than doubled. Larceny, more than doubled. Now, that could be a difference in how much of this is reported, but the perception of an increase of crime between the early period of the baby boomers entering and the 1970s is backed up statistically. But then let's look at 1980. Remember, this was the beginning of the tough on crime period. And again, the population has risen, but I want you to look at this because it hasn't risen by a huge amount. We're still at 225 million people with some change, but violent crime is now 2/3 higher than it was in 1960. Property crime is 4 times higher. Murder has now doubled from 1960. Forcible rape, as problematic as those stats are, had tripled since 1960, going up to 36.8 per 100,000. And again, that might be a difference in reporting and the definition. I want you to know that. There's ways you can lie with these numbers, even using good ones. So I'm not going to give you that I know the narrative reason why this happened, but it happened. Robbery had increased from, go back to 1960, it had been 60 per 100,000. Now it's 251 per 100,000. Aggravated assault has tripled from 1960. Burglary has tripled from 1960. Larceny has tripled from 1960 to 1980. Vehicle theft had gone up dramatically. Now there is a dip in 81, but not much of one. So 1980 seems to be a high point. Let's look at 1990 then. We see an increase of the population by a lot more than had been increasing in the prior years. Now we're at almost 250 million. Violent crime is still going up. Property crime has stayed about the same. So this perception that in 1990 things were more violent, that's actually bared out. However, murder was actually a little lower. Rape continues to rise. Remember, rape stats are almost always underreported too. Robbery had stayed about the same. Aggravated assault had increased dramatically. Burglary had gone down. Larceny had stayed about the same, and vehicle theft had increased by about 150 per 100,000. So the idea that in the 1990s there was violence in the streets, but there wasn't even necessarily a lot more property crime, definitely bared out by the statistics. And we have to think about this as the height of the drug war. But we also have to look at when these, really tough on crime bills kick in. Because I want us to look at this. When people think that incarceration will fix this, I actually think we have to look at the numbers there too. And we'll come back at that. So in 2000, Population is growing pretty rapidly in the United States. We're now up to 281 million. Violent crime has dropped by 100,000. So this led people to believe that the tough on crime stuff that we often attribute to Reagan's America, but really seems to have been implemented under Clinton's America, it did something. Clinton tried to claim that we called him racist for claiming it, and it probably was. But my point is that there was a effect. Now, I don't think that affect's totally due to incarceration. There's also the fact that economic conditions in America were actually pretty decent in the late 1990s. They weren't 1950s post-war boom height of imperialism decent, but they were decent. Property crime has decreased dramatically. Murder is now back down to what it was in about 1966. Rape statistics are bad, but they're down from 1990. Robbery has decreased significantly. Aggravated assault still weirdly higher, but it's decreased significantly. Burglary has gone down to levels below what we have seen since 1966. Theft has gone down. Vehicle theft has gone down. 2010, population has increased. All right. We're now at 300,000. So we have not 300,000, 300 million. We have 100 million more people than in 1960. All right. Violent crime is still going down. It is almost half of what, not quite, but it's almost half of what it was in 1990. Property crime is half of what it was in 1990. Murder, not going down as significantly, but it's going down. Rape declined. Robbery declined. Aggravated assault declined. Burglary declined. Larceny declined. Vehicle theft declined. In 2019, we are up to almost modern population, where we are beginning to actually probably go down from this population. I don't know if we're at peak population yet or not. We're at 328 million. I think we're now at around 330 million, but we don't seem to be increasing. So our rate of growth has slowed dramatically from the end of the 20th century. Violent crime had gone down even more. Property crime had gone down even more. Murder had gone up just a little bit. Rape had gone up quite a bit. That although in 2016 there's a change in way we report rapes, so we started actually reporting things like male prison rapes. So that's part of that statistics, but it's not all of it. I can't explain it all just by looking at the numbers, and I'm not willing to turn these numbers into a narrative that I don't know. Robbery had gone down. Aggravated assault had gone down. Burglary had gone down. Larceny theft had gone down. Vehicle theft had gone down. Where are we at today? So I'm going to pull from another set of stats so you can see where we are today. Now, this is from State Home. This is from the FBI's Crime in the United States report. Take all that with a grain of salt. What we see is that violent crimes went up dramatically in 2021 and 2022, but they have declined in 2023 and 2024. But property crime continues to rise at about 7% of an increase. That is a reversal of a trend that was 20 years prior. Baltimore is now the most dangerous city in America. It's surpassed Detroit, and Detroit surpassed New Orleans among cities with a population of 250,000 or more. Now, if we look at actual neighborhoods, this gets different. The largest cities, Seattle and San Francisco, have very high property crime rates, but very low murder rates. Salt Lake has a really high rape rate and larceny theft rate, which is interesting, but only among small size cities. Cities as Spokane, Tukwila, Kent, Tacoma, Washington ranked in the top 3 for all kinds of property crime. All right, let's look at this. So we see a decrease in rape numbers between 2021 and 2022. We see a decrease in aggravated assault numbers. We see a decrease in homicides, but homicides were up. Americans' perception of crime being on the upward trend is certainly true regarding property crime in recent years. Property crime rose 7% between 21 and 2022. So this is like the opposite of 1990s, where property crime was going up and not as quickly as violent crime was escalating dramatically, which, again, my thesis that I have not bothered to prove is that was tied to the drug war. Motor vehicle thefts increased by 11% in the same period because motor vehicles are worth a lot more money now. I think that was easy to explain. Theft without violence or break-in increased 8%. Burglary rates have remained constant since 2012. All right, murder per 100,000. Memphis, Tennessee, Detroit, Michigan, and Baltimore, Maryland are the 3 most dangerous cities. Aggravated assault, that's Memphis, Tennessee again, Detroit, Michigan, and Kansas City, Missouri. Cities with more than 250,000 and less than 500,000. Murder, that remains New Orleans. And that rate per 100,000 is actually higher than Baltimore's. So I take that back. New Orleans is still the murder capital of the country. St. Louis is next. Those stats have been pretty consistent for like decades that they're bad. Anchorage, Ohio is another one. And then small cities, which are cities in less than 250,000, but more than 100,000, like where I live. The Birmingham, Alabama is almost close to New Orleans. Salt Lake City is weirdly high in rape. Then Colorado, then Ohio. It seems to be, that's interesting. I wonder what's driving that. I actually have no idea, and I did not know that. Okay. What's my point about this? My point about this is most of the discussions about these crime rates are deceptive. Murder is been between 5 and 10 per 100,000 for most of the 20th century. There are places in the United States that are way more dangerous. St. Louis, New Orleans, Detroit, Baltimore, Memphis, Tennessee, Birmingham, Alabama. They are not predominantly in the areas that we talk about. We often talk about Chicago, LA, and New York. Well, New York is one of the safer cities in America. LA is fairly safe. Chicago is more dangerous in parts. Now, some of the most dangerous areas, however, like Skid Row in LA, are in specific, very low income, very areas with a lot of homelessness in some cities that are otherwise fairly safe, because even these statistics can be misleading. What's my point? All right, what's my point to talk about these crime statistics? One, the perception that crime is getting worse is true in the case of property crime. Murder in the United States is higher than most of its comparative OECD countries. A lot of that does seem to have to do with firearm availability. When you look at violent assaults, the difference not quite as extreme, although there's still a difference. But here's my other point. Incarceration doesn't solve this. And neither does just hoping that it goes away because of Democrats in power. All right. There have been an attempt to weaponize this in partisan narratives, and it really kind of doesn't map onto that. I also want to say that while I think a lot of these crimes would be reduced in a socialist society. I don't think all of them would be. You have to do a lot to deal with the murder rate. Um, but I want to point out something about incarceration rates. I'm going to be lazy and use Wikipedia for this because it actually gives a good uh, breakdown that's easy to find. I did, however, check the Wikipedia sources and make sure that they were valid. Because, Wikipedia is not unproblematic, but it's not inaccurate either. Let's look at this real fast. Incarceration cannot be the answer to the problem. The U.S. has the sixth highest incarceration rate in the world. That is 531 people per 100,000. Let's look at that real fast. Now, who places have higher? In absolute numbers, it is the United States, then China. But remember, China's population is significantly higher than the United States is, and it has less of a total prison population. So the prison population in the United States is 1,808,000, and the prison population in China, which has over 1 billion people, is 1,690,000. The next is Brazil at 850,000, then India at 573,000, then the Russian Federation at 433,000, Turkey, Thailand, Indonesia, Mexico. We can see a trend here, and that is not equal to the OECD. So that fifth, this is why we check everything. Now, if we look at per capita, it might be slightly different, but nonetheless, it's pretty bad. So I don't know why it says it's the fifth. Anyway, back into this. I'll list this in the show notes. State and federal prisons and local jails dropped 14% from 2019 to 2020. So we have seen a decrease in prison population pretty significantly in the U.S. A lot of that has to do with decriminalizing marijuana. A lot of that has to do with not enforcing the laws. The states with the highest rates of incarceration are Mississippi and Louisiana. Those are not the safest states, by the way. We can get into the rates here. So the incarceration rate in the United States in 1940 was 201 for 100,000. In 2021, it was 531 per 1,000. The high point of incarceration rates in America was 2008, which had 755 per 100,000. Notice that this doesn't actually correlate very well to the chart we saw on violent crime. So I bring that up because the right-wing cursorial answers aren't answers. But neither is pretending like this doesn't happen, or pretending like it only affects certain marginalized people or only peoples of color, although it disproportionately affects them, as does over-policing, etc. You have to deal with these problems if you want to get rid of the oppressive structures in the United States. So in 2020, we had the movement against police, all cops are bastards, etc. A lot of that's been reversed today, particularly with Democrats who toyed with that rhetoric, but then immediately dropped it when it was unpopular. Why did it become unpopular? Well, first, the murder rate went up a little bit, but property crime went up significantly, and the murder rate went up a little bit from an all-time low. But it's still higher than it should be. Even in a capitalist society, the US is not doing well. And incarceration itself is not an answer to it. So the question becomes, how do you have an answer to it? And don't just say it's throwing social services at people, because that is part of the answer. But there are organized crime elements in some of this that you have to deal with. There's domestic violence in some of this that you have to deal with. There is the cost of substance abuse on some of this that you have to deal with, etc., etc., etc. Now, when you look at comparison to countries with similar rates of immigration, Germany has about the same rate of immigration as the United States as of 2022. It has 67 per 100,000 in prison. So you can't just blame that on immigrants. Sorry. Italy, 97 per 100,000 in prison. And that's despite the fact that also the stats actually indicate that a lot of legal immigrants commit less crime, and illegal immigrants, it's hard to know because by definition we don't have good numbers on them. And we can make the moral point about no one being illegal, but it is, I'm just reporting what the statutes say. Compared to other countries with relatively zero tolerance for illegal drugs, such as Russia, which has 304 per 100,000 as of 2022, Kazakhstan, which has 184 per 100,000. Even with the declines that we've seen in the United States, we are still like a little under half worse than Russia. We're double Kazakhstan. So we have, both in terms of our incarceration policy and in our dealing with the quote surplus population, which I think has a lot to do with what we're doing, but also in terms of actual crime rates, it doesn't look great. This is a sign of social decay. And I don't hear a lot of people discussing what a left response to this would be, other than either throwing social services at it or basically returning to the status quo and complaining about how we need to lock more people up. Both of which, by the way, I think end up leading people to take more and more reactionary positions to the problems. Now, here's the question. What is a reformist strategy for that, and what is a radical strategy for that? Like, these are questions that we should be asking. I'm not here to tell you the answers for it. I'm not here to blame, poor people. But I do think it's funny that, when I say something like, well, we should house the homeless, and that doesn't take care of everything. It doesn't take care of addiction problems. It doesn't take care of long-term systemic policy. I say that absolutely, completely, but it's better than unstable, ad hoc homeless shelters that may not even be all that sanitary and collect people in ways that open them up for all kinds of abuse. And it's better than letting them be on the street for everybody. But you have to have an answer to it. And when it comes to homelessness, there's a new phenomenon starting in the 20 teens of people who have employment and are long-term homeless in areas like California and New York. More in California than a lot of other places. The Fordist infrastructure in New York is a lot better than the kind of neoliberal infrastructure in California, and you do actually have to look at that. But I mean, a lot of the money thrown in California seems to go to things like NGOs that don't seem particularly effective. Whereas Eric Adams was trying to use, the migrant crisis to dismantle the protections for the homeless in New York, but nonetheless, New York has a better way of handling it than California does. Lefts that don't look at this honestly can't do much about it. Right. I had a friend of mine, friend of the show, David E., who rightly chastised me for saying the working class was drug-addled, because what I really should have said is American culture is drug-addled. The working class doesn't have resources to deal with it. But why is that? And how do you fix it? Right. I'm not here to propose easy answers for you. I'm here to get you to talk about it honestly so that we can fix it. And no, Law and Order, lock them up and throw away the key did not work. The countries that do better than us do not do that. So even in terms of liberal capitalist politics, we are failing. We must recognize that for what it is to do anything about it. Like and subscribe, protect your peace. Have a nice day.